We are continuing in our discussion of the laws of the Kachal here. We are continuing in Yoreh, Siman Sadi. We are in Yoreh chapter 90, and we are in Sif Beis discussing the proper procedure for when we are going to cook udder. And the reason why this has been really important is because we learned a lot of important laws that we're going to need further along our journey in Hilchos Basar B'Chalav. But it's important to also understand that sometimes, even when we learn what the Gemara says is the halacha, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's always the final halacha. And we're going to explore some of that now as well. So the importance of this class, what I'd like you to get out of it, is to understand that sometimes the way in which we would like the halacha to fall out isn't always the way the halacha actually plays out. And you have to have a little bit of an understanding of how we value everyone who's contributed to the process of deciding the final halacha. So we said in the Sif Beis, after we've gone back and discussed the laws of the Talmud significantly, we've discussed how a kachal can become a piece of prohibited meat, a chaticha nasis nevela. We've talked about the issue of how you measure the shishim, the 60 times, whether you include the volume of the kachal. A lot of things going back and forth, all the sources from the Gemara. We did mention earlier on in the shir that there is just a completely different way to learn this whole sugya. So what is our actual custom that plays out? Is there a difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi when it comes to the final minhag? So the Tur says that there is already an established custom not to cook the kachal with meat even after you did all the slicing and dicing and smashing, right? Where you slice it lengthwise and widthwise and you squish it against the wall. And even if you cook it by itself, okay, we're also going to require that as well. So the question is, where does this minhag come from? So the Tur brings it down that this is our minhag. So the Beis Yosef says here that based on the Sefer HaTruma and the Mordechai and the Hagos Hagos Maimonios, the main thing seems to be that this minhag developed specifically because we weren't really sure how a lot of people would learn this sugya. Okay? We weren't really sure. And so we mentioned there was a lot of opinions about whether or not our understanding of Rashi was accurate. So there's no other way to really get around it. So we mentioned previously the Rabbeinu Yerucham, we mentioned the Ran, that it might be a way to learn Rashi a different way in the Gemara. Okay? And we saw there was a lot of different opinions on what that looked like. You had the Rush and you had the Rabbeinu Tam. Nonetheless, the custom seems to fit this one understanding that we attribute to Rashi, and we want to be more stringent based on that opinion. The Beis Yosef also quotes the Smak, who is the actual source for saying Rashi is learned this way, which is that the whole Jewish world has taken on the custom to not cook the chachal, to not cook the udder with other meat. Okay, even if you've done all the preparations. And the reason why this is important to note, but yet somewhat difficult, because it seems like there's a majority of positions who would say this is perfectly fine. Is because there seems to be one approach of Rashi, which we had noted, that seems to say that it was for cooking alone without having meat with it. Okay? And so therefore, we don't want to simply straight up permit that. Okay? That's the first approach. So that's what we said. Okay? That's what we're going to say, is that you should be doing it. Now, does that mean that we also want to preclude cooking udders altogether? So the Tur points that out. He says, first of all, there's a custom not to cook the kachal, the udder, with other meat. Okay? And there's also included in that custom is not to cook the udder at all. Okay? unless you have done the slicing the lengthwise and widthwise and smashing against the wall. So the Beis Yosef says that the opinion of the Ran is that there was such a type of an issue, but the Darchei Moshe points out that there was a tshuva from the Gaonim. So if you go back to our first year that we gave, that there was a tshuva from the Gaonim that you should not be cooking the kachal. Okay, so there was this long-standing custom from Babylonian Rosh Yeshiva not to do cooking at all. So from the Ran and the Rebbeinu Yerucham, a lot of people they're not aware of this, but there was from some people such a custom. Okay, and there's also in the customs of the Ashkenazim from the Maharai. Okay, that which would be Rav Israel Yisraelin. Okay, he says that the custom is not to cook the kachal at all, even to put it into a pot pie would also not be appropriate. So that's what we do. Okay, he says sometimes there are people who will do that, but we try not to follow that. We want to follow the minhag is not to cook it at all. So the Beis Yosef quotes the Smak, and he says that that's why this tradition developed further on. So that's what we're going to follow. Okay, this Tshuvas HaGaonim is also quoted in the Hagaos Ashri on the Sefer Isser V'Heter Ha'aruch. Okay, so it's another book, and it is the Ashri wrote a lot of these little comments. He also wrote on the Rush as well. And he quotes this tshuva. Okay, he does say there's a difference if it is dried out by an udder. So here's what we have. So the Torah and the Beis Yosef said that the minhag is to not cook the kachal with the udder, with the other meat, and no matter what preparation is done. Okay, they don't feel that there's necessarily a minhag to prohibit it, but they quote other opinions that say there are. Those other opinions are the Shari Dura and the Taras Chatas, that there is such a minhag, and that would follow this custom developed in Ashkenaz, separate and apart from other places where they don't mention this custom. And they quote a tshuva from the Gaonim. Apparently somebody in Ashkenaz went and asked them, and they said not to cook it with other meat. And then there is this, and there's a Hagos Asheri who says the same thing. Okay, that he mentions the Tshuvas HaGaonim, he does put a little stipulation on it that if it's dried out and there's no more milk inside of it, you could permit it. Okay, so we read previously. There's a really long thing about the Mechaber and the Ramah about how we finally make the final decision. So what if So there's a lot to say about in that Ramah, that long Ramah, about what happens if you went ahead and did it. So according to the Beis Yosef, the problem is only to cook it with other meat. So if you went ahead and did it, and you want to know what the rule would be if you did an oopsie and cooked it together with other meat. So you went ahead and sliced open your kachal, you sliced it lengthwise, you sliced it widthwise, and you smashed it against the wall. But instead of roasting it, you cooked it in a pot with other meat. Then that would be permitted because that is the main law. The minhag is just not to do that. The main law is just to say that it would be fine. However, if you didn't do any of the cutting, you would then need to measure 60 times against the volume. And as we learned in the previous year, the udder is going to count towards that 60. So you're going to measure against whatever milk is inside of the udder. Okay? However, we're not going to permit you to eat the kachal since you're cooking it and the prohibited substance, the milk, is inside of it. It's going to get absorbed in it more quickly. And this opinion is stated explicitly by the Shach here on Sif Beis in note number 6 for him. But it is that basically if you went ahead and did the cooking, it's pretty clear from Sif Aleph that that would be permitted. And the Ramah also agrees with this. It's just that he's going to have some other things to say. Okay? What about the more stringent minhag? Okay, which will be brought down by the Ramah himself. So that smak who says that you can't even cook the kachal at all, he would actually agree that it would be okay to consume it as long as it was sliced open and diced open. Now what if you didn't do that? Okay, so there are some people who actually are even strict to say that if you do cook it at all, you shouldn't eat it because you've put the milky flavor in with it, even though the milk isn't the prohibited flavor. However, the Torah's Chatas himself, the Ramah himself in that book, he says that if there's a big loss, there's no reason not to rely on the lenient opinions, even though there's a number of people who say that they had gotten their answer not to do this, right? And therefore, he and the Shulchan Aruch would agree with this case. There is also the Bach, the Taz, and the Marshal, who all agree that the main halacha is like those other Rishonim, not to be strict. Okay. Okay. However, if you cook it with other meat, you should look at it as if it was something that was prohibited by being legislated against. It's called davar hanes arbaminyan. Okay, so that's what they say. So they agree that the ikar halacha is that way, but they bring up another reason, which is to say that a bunch of rabbis got together and made a ruling against it. The Shach says that this opinion of the Marshal, he over there was permitting it with meat, even as long as you did the slice lengthwise and widthwise and smash it against the wall, and even without the significant loss, not without half meruba. So the Marshal it's not clear. So in his work Isser V'Heter, he says to be strict, but in his work on Kol Basar, on the Gemara in Chulin, he seems to take a different approach. Okay? And the Pri Megadim says, I don't know why the Taz and the Shach can't get this opinion of these two people together. So, because basically between the Taz, I didn't tell you where the Taz was. This Taz is here on Sif Bays, and it's the 8th Taz, Taz number 8. So the Pri Megadim says that the Taz is quoting over here that this Marshal should say that it's prohibited, and that there seems to be legislation against it. It's not just a minhag anymore. They've legislated. They've said, rabbis got together. They said, no, you can't eat this. So there is this machlokas between them. So, there is this problem. So what do we do with that? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Let's just remind ourselves that this could be only an issue Rabbanan, and we see that there's this clear dispute about what the Maharshal was actually saying. Okay, so now that we say that the kachal is not allowed to be used, so we would have previously learned that certain parts of the animal require their own unique kalim, like the liver, for example, because you need to kasher it from the blood. It needs to be broiled, its own special pan that's just used for that. So do you need something like that for a kachal if the minhag is to say you can't cook it with other meat? You need a special udder pan. Okay, so the Torah points out that you need to cook the udder by itself, and you have to do the lengthwise and widthwise slice, and then to smash it against the wall. And he also adds the words that there be a pot specifically for this purpose. Okay, and the Beis Yosef quotes the Smak and says that if we were going to go ahead and have a separate pot, that's good. He says that the only problem is that we don't really eat that much kachal nowadays, according to the Smak. So maybe you'll cook this with other meat, okay, or use that pot for something else. So he says that we also have a custom that if you're going to make the kachal, you can cut it with a meat knife, and that's even to say it's cut with a meat knife, even if the kachal is still very hot. because you already went ahead and sliced it and smashed it against the wall. Okay, so you should treat it like meat at that point. So the Beis Yosef asks on this, he says, I'm not sure what the difference is between cooking it in its own pot, where you were saying not to do that, and now you're going ahead and using the knife for it, especially when there's no other meat being cooked in there. So we just don't want you to do that because of this one stringency in the way that they're learning Rashi, and this response they got from the Gaonim. Okay, so that's what he says. I'm not sure. And then he quotes the Rashba. The Rashba asks the following question. He says, "Is it permitted to cook the kachal in a meat pot?" Right. So today you went and cooked a bunch of stew in a pot, and now you want to use it to cook up the kachal. Right. Maybe you shechted a cow today. You got through most of the cow, and you have some udder left over. You want to cook some udder. Okay. So the Rashba seems to imply that it might actually be okay, and he seems to imply even if it wasn't cut correctly, we had mentioned previously the Rashba would suffice to even do a slight cut in it, and he mentioned that over here as well. So even after the fact, even with this minhag, it's entirely possible to say that you don't need to necessarily have a problem with having a separate pot, despite the Torah's insistence on doing that. However, the Torah Sabayis says that you shouldn't do that. Okay? And so that seems to be the problem, not necessarily the language of anybody else, other than the way the Smak, the Sefer Mitzvos, is recording this minhag. Okay? So, the problem is that we're going to require people to go ahead and slice it and dice it, okay? In order to go ahead and use it, if you're following the opinion of the Ramah. So the question really is, if the minhag was just not to cook it, then the only issue should be with the pot. And the Shach actually makes this point. However, Rabbi Kiva Eger, he says that the difference between the two is that by a pot, you're going to cook a bunch of things together, whereas the knife, you're going to do it one after the other. So it's not necessarily going to be all done at the same time. Okay? And a number of people all say over here that the minhag is to have a special pot for the udder, okay, and a special knife. And then Rabbi Kiva Eger points out that you can't use the pot where you cook the kachal in it for other meat. So he's treating it kind of like you would treat liver, okay. And he says you should be stringent on that, even to the highest levels they required it over here, which is to say you shouldn't eat it afterwards. Okay, kind of strict, but that's what he says. However, if it was not used in 24 hours, of course you could be lenient on such a thing. Okay. Now the other say for Shulchan Gavoa and the Yad Yehuda, they says if you go ahead and cook the kachal in a fleishik pot, and you cooked it that day, they say that it would be mutter to cook in that pot. All right, you're allowed to do that. Okay, and then everything would be permitted. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. And then if you went and did it the other way, you could use the pot back for meat again. So, having discussed all this in the tour, how do the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch decide this law? So the Mechaber says that the custom is not to cook the kachal with other meat, and to cook it by itself, to fry it or to put it into a pot pie, you have to slice it lengthwise and widthwise and smash it against the wall. And then also to roast it, you have to do the same thing, but not to smash it against the wall. The Ramah then adds the following. It says, if you went ahead and cooked it, we just said the minhag is not to cook it. If you went ahead and cooked it, if you did the slicing and the smashing against the wall, then there's reason to permit it after the fact in the case of significant loss, okay? But without that, you really shouldn't be lenient. And when we say that people go ahead and slice it many, many times, that's actually better than doing the smashing against the wall thing, okay? Roasting it, that we're going to go ahead and slice it, okay? And we're going to add smashing it against the wall. Okay? Now, if you didn't do the smashing against the wall and roasted it anyway, so that's fine. And it says, even if you forgot to roast it, we're going to follow the most lenient opinion that it's also good, as long as it's by itself. So not like in the Gemara, it mentions it being on top of the meat, on the bottom of the meat. I'm not going to do any of that. If it was roasted with meat, okay, and you cut it open and smash it against the wall, then everything's fine. And without that, then whatever's on top is good, whatever's on the bottom is prohibited. So that was from the Gemara. But we never say both are prohibited, because maybe it was flipped back and forth. So we don't assume that you did that, and that we don't make it mutter, we don't make it users. But technically, you shouldn't be roasting them together at all. And by cooking it by itself, we don't allow that at all. Okay, which is different than the mechaber. So the Ramah disagrees with that. We also don't fry it. Okay. And then we talk about drying it out before we do anything with it. If you dried it out and then you cooked it, you still violated the terms of the custom. However, as long as it was sliced open, then there's room to be lenient in there, because we saw that was a difference between the Hagos Asheri and the Smaka. So whether or not the Gaonim told them not to be strict on that. Okay. Now, to go ahead and make a pot pie out of it on its own, we're allowed to do that if there's if it's not cooked in a closed pan, okay? But if it's in a closed pan, then it's like it's being cooked, and you're not allowed to do that. And some people who are even more strict by every type of pot pie, and therefore you're not allowed to do it unless you dry out the udder completely. Some people are strict not to make a pashtida, not to make a pot pie out of the udder, and to cook it with a pot pie that's a meat pot pie in the same oven. If it's a small oven, you would have to do one on top of the other, okay, or cover one. And you also should be careful, but still, it's just a stringency. Okay, so we see the mechaber is straightforward like the Beis Yosef. So, and we see the Ramah is a little bit more strict when it comes to the other aspects of it. Okay, so now there's a difference of opinion about what exactly this filled pie is. What is a pashtida? So the Chachmas Adam actually points out over here. This is in his work, chapter 41, number 10. He says a pashtida is something where you take the udder and you put it inside of a dough and you bake them together. Okay, it's like anytime you bake the filled bread. Okay, so the mechaber, there's no real chiddush over here about how to make the pot pie. He's saying that there's nothing special about it because you already sliced it open, so it doesn't matter how you make it. So he's just including it anyway. So the Shach points out that if you're making a pashtida, okay, he's just trying to actually equate frying with cooking. Okay, that's what he seems to be saying at one point. But in another place over here, he seems to be saying that we're not going to cook it by itself. You also shouldn't be frying it by itself. Okay, so the Beis Yosef is trying to say that whether you're cooking it or frying it, the custom is not to cook it by itself. Okay, so that's what he's getting at. And so therefore, when we add on the pashtida doesn't have to be fried or baked, or cooked. However you slice it, as long as it's sliced, it's going to be fine to eat. Now the Ramah, however, is since he's the author of Torah's Chatas, he was the one who was saying that doing it by itself is not permitted. Okay, so that was what we mentioned before by that opinion. Okay, so he therefore doesn't agree with the Maharshal that we mentioned earlier. However, there is the Taz and the Bach who say the Maharshal learns differently. And therefore, we also have the Shach who would agree with the Ramah's understanding of this. The Ramah also says we don't fry it. Okay, So the reason why that is because he's taking that strict approach in Rashi, and we mentioned that earlier. And we also don't cook it with meat, and we don't cook with meat even when it's sliced and diced and all that other fun stuff. But the thing is that, which we'll come back to from the Gemara, is that when you have it one roasting on top and on the bottom, is that if you did flip it on the skewer, then your concern is that the flavors are going to be one below and one the other one. So they don't always stay straight like this. Sometimes go straight up, sometimes they go the other way. And so therefore you aren't supposed to put them together, but you could be lenient after the fact. The Madneh Shulchan here, he adds something interesting. He says if it's only one skewer and you don't have any other meat, and you're going to lose all the meat if you don't do something about this, okay, such as like it's Erev Shabbos, and you're not going to have time to, let's say, roast it so that way the udder is going to be at the bottom of it, or you're going to be able to use, you don't have enough time, you need to use the udder, the skewer to roast two udders. He said those things should be cooked together as long as they are sliced open and properly, lengthwise and widthwise, and smashed against the wall. Okay, and you have to just keep them away from each other so that they're not touching each other. And you also shouldn't tilt one towards the other on the skewer. So those things would then be okay. So this is an interesting halacha that he brings down, but that's how we would understand the Ramah. Okay, and that's the shas of the chak that we would be talking about, and slicing them open correctly. Continuing in the Ramah, we don't do any cooking of the kachal. Okay, and there's some room to be lenient if you let it dry out, because according to the Ramah, he's saying that the kachal by itself, in his other work, the Torah Schat, that's recorded on the tour, is going to say it's fine. The Ramah is also going to say that by letting it dry out, it's also going to be fine. If you did that, you shouldn't, but if you did, because we see that it's dried out and there's no milk left inside of it. Okay. The Chachos Adam in this place over here points out that according to the Ramah, if you went ahead and cooked a dry kachal with other meat, that's also permitted, and even if you forgot to slice it, because the milk is gone, okay, and therefore there's going to be no flavor to it. The Gra says that based on his reading of the smak, and it's a rabbinic prohibition, that's why it's permitted, is because there was no gezerah in such a case where it dries out. The Aruch Shulchan says that the milk is also dried out, and it seems to be across the board according to the Mechaber and the Ramah. Okay, and we saw that was the case. We brought this earlier from the Israel. Okay, so interesting thing over here. The Minchas Yaakov over here points out that the Ramah says by Hilchos Pesach, this is in Siman Tuf Mem Zayin if Hey, that it's only dried out when it's been sitting for 60 days, for 2 months. And there he's quoting the Trumas Hadeshen. So what's going on? So why does it only work for 30 days? So the Shach says that is whether you see it's dried out or not. So 30 days, you go check out it's dry. If not, if it's been 60 days, for sure it's dry. Okay? Then so in the Hagos Asheri from the Trumas Hagaonim, he says that was actually mentioned by the Gaonim initially in their original thing. However, the Isser V'Heter disagreed. This was the work of the Marshal. He seems to say differently. So the Ramah says that's why you can't do it, but if you went ahead and did it, that's something else. Okay? That's fine. And so if it's dried out and you cook it with other meat, the Ashri brings down in the name of Or Zerua that, again, dried out, and there's no milk left in it, of course we're going to permit it. And you don't even need to measure shishim. Okay? And that's their opinion. And the last thing over here about making the pot pie, according to the Ramah, the minhag is not to allow you to bake it. I mean, not allowed you to cook it, and to bake it in the oven in a dough is the same thing as cooking it. Okay, and so therefore that wouldn't be permitted, and it would also be the same as frying it, which we're also not going to allow. However, there are the Ramah himself says that the pashtita is actually mutter, and so that's why the Ramah over here makes the point of saying that if it's in a machavas, it's aser. So the reason why it's prohibited is because you're putting it inside of a closed container and it's basically simmering in its own juices. But if you just wrap it in the dough and don't put it inside of that, and it's cooking on something where the air can get all around it, it's no longer cooking, it's now being baked. And the baking would be okay. And that's why he brings it over here that the pashtita would be permitted when it's not inside of a machava, it's not inside of a deep dish pie. So therefore, according to the Mechaber and the Ramah, if it's a dried out kachal and you sliced it open, then you can go ahead and use it to make a pot pie. However, the Marshal that's brought down says that it's prohibited. So the Shach asks the question. He says that in another place, we prohibit cooking the meat inside of a dough, because you're actually cooking it inside. It's like cooking inside of a pot. This one's different because this is only a minhag, so we weren't so strict on the minhag in this case. Okay, and the Ramah finally says that there are people who don't make the pashtita at all. They won't share the oven where they make the pashtita with other meat. If it's a small oven, if it's a big oven, that's okay. And if he says if you're going to need the room to bake all of them together, then you should put the dough wrapped udder at the edge of the oven where it's closest to the vent, and that way the flavor goes out. So again, because this is only a custom, we're more lenient on it. Okay, so just to kind of go over that real quick. The Torah says that we have a minhag not to do the cooking, but we could do the frying and we could do the pashtita, right? And we just don't want you to do the cooking them together. We said it's because of this smock, our friend the smock, and that's what they bring down. There's even more strictures brought down by the Sharei Dura and Torah Chatas that you shouldn't cook it at all, and they get it from a Tshuvas HaGaonim like that, and also learn from Rashi like that. And then there's the Hagos Ashri and the Smock who say the Tshuvas HaGaonim was even more strict, but then they argue as to whether or not if it's dried out and there's no more milk there, if that's okay. Okay? And so they also say that you really shouldn't permit the difference between the Mechaber and the Ramah, you shouldn't permit cooking it with other meat unless it's a big loss. Okay? But the Mechaber would say it's okay as long as you did everything correct with all the slicing. There's also machlokas between the Taz and the Shach as to what is the opinion of the Maharshal. It seems that the opinions are not clear about whether or not you must be even more strict. So when we say not to cook it, is that even to prohibit it after the fact or not? So there's two opinions to that. And the Ramah says that if you went ahead and do the cooking of it, as long as you prepared it properly, then you could go ahead and rely on the Ikar Adin, as long as it's also a big loss. Okay, but you shouldn't permit it. And we also allow you to go ahead and cook it in a pot pie, as long as it's not inside of a pan. It makes it more like cooking. So what do we see from all of these laws of halacha? So here's what we learned from Sif Aleph and Sif Beis. So the kachal, when it's cooked with its milk in it, or if it's cooked with if another piece of meat is cooked with the milk from the kachal, it's Torah level milk. Okay, it's not Torah level milk because it's called chalav shchuta, and so therefore there's no Torah prohibition on it. That there is a rabbinic prohibition on it. Okay? And you also, but then you're not allowed to go ahead and take the kahal and sell it to a non-Jew, because if there's some marking on it that could tell you that it was kosher, they might go ahead and sell it back to the Jew. Okay? So, if you wanted, let's say, sell it to a non-Jew, you could cook it for that purpose. And same thing to do, the Ramah holds that, as long as you're not selling it to a Jew to eat. So, as long as you do the slice and the dice and smashing it on the wall, this actually, according to the din of the Gemara, permits you to eat it by itself or with meat, and whether it's roasted or whether it's cooked. Okay? But that we have this extra minhag not to do that when you're going to cook it with other meat, but we'll rely on this din after the fact. Okay? He also says that you don't have to do a full slicing and smashing, but that's what we require lechatchila. So if you didn't do that, it would be okay. The Mechaber also says that if you just cook it, if you roast it to cook it just enough, or to fry it in a pan, and you want to eat it, then you need to go ahead and do all the slicing and dicing and smashing. However, the Ramah is going to say that if you're going to roast it, so you still need to do full slicing, unlike the Mechaber. And if you didn't do that, you shouldn't eat it. Okay? But he's not going to say that in Sif Aleph, he says that in Sif Beis. If you cook the udder with other meat, without doing any slicing, you need to measure 60 times against the entire kahal, and the kahal counts towards the 60 permitted side of it. But the kahal itself is going to be prohibited because the milk is still in it and it's more quickly absorbed into the udder. Okay? It's always going to be prohibited. If the kahal itself falls into another pot after it's been prohibited in this one, the Mechaber says that you're going to need shishim against it, even if there were shishim against it originally. So you're going to have to add the whole thing together now. Okay? And so, nonetheless, he is lenient because it's only a rabbinic prohibition absorbed inside of it, even though the kahal itself is prohibited. Okay? And so he also, and that's because of what we learned before of the rule by Chaticha Nas Nevela. He Batsim holds like the Rashba of Efsher L'Sochto, just that Efsher L'Sochto is usher, that you could technically separate the prohibited flavor, just that we don't do that. The Ramah disagrees, and if there wasn't 60 times against it in the first pot, the kahal does not count towards the 60 in the second pot. Okay? Because now it's going to be Nasis Nevela. Because the machlokas we discussed before is whether you say Chadicha Nas Nevela, does the whole object become a brand new prohibited object? We say that even by rabbinic prohibitions. Okay? At the first time when you count it towards the 60, you have to take the whole kahal out of the pot. Okay? So that's part of it. That there were 60 times against the kahal again in the first pot, and you didn't take it out by itself to cook with the milk inside of it, then the kahal is going to continue to count towards the permitted material, to go ahead and count against the milky flavor. Okay? You have to measure against what the kahal looks like now that you've caught it, and not assume it was actually bigger. When the prohibited substance was in there, you have to measure against 6 times against that prohibited substance. And you don't go at the end of the whole thing. You see at the time when you dropped it in there. You also have to measure at the time of when it falls in, that you eat shishim. Okay? So you if you can't tell right now, but at some point you do tell it, right? So right, it's not, you can't measure the prohibited substance, it's like stuck inside of it. So if it looks like there was more there, and by the time you get to measure it, then you can rely on that, because you can't be machzik it, so you weren't sure of it. And if at the point when the udder falls in, there was 60 times against it, but it reduces with the cooking, if you watch it the whole time it's in there and cook, it's going to be prohibited, because you're seeing that there wasn't 60 times against it. Okay? That's what Sif Aleph teaches us. Sif Beis tells us that we don't cook the things together. The Mechaber and the Ramah pretty much agree on the not cooking thing. The Kaf HaChaim points out that according to the Mechaber, if you cook the kachal by itself and you didn't do any slicing, that you could go ahead and still eat it, but you would need to wait 24 hours, and then you could use the pot it was cooked in, because we still are saying there's a minhag not to use it. You have to wait a full 24 hours. You can only use a single leniency. Some people will be lenient, maybe say 12 hours. Okay? According to the Ramah, the minhag is not to cook it together, and if you cook it by itself, you're supposed to have a separate pot for it. Okay? And according to the Ramah, if you cooked it, but if you forgot to slice it, then everything becomes prohibited. Okay? If you don't have more than 6 times the milk inside of it. But then everything would be fine. If you violate the minhag and you cook the kachal by itself, and you went ahead and sliced it and diced it and smashed it against the wall, then even the Ramah consents to the fact that it should be permitted. However, the other person who hold like that Marshal would disagree with that. Okay, so that's a lot to take out from that. So let's see what else over here. The Ber Heitev says that someone who eats kachal after cheese, he also needs to wipe out his mouth and rinse his mouth and wash his hands. Okay? So, because it has to be treated like eating regular meat. So with that, we wrap up a lot of rules about cooking and roasting the kachal. We still have some more rules about the kachal. I'm sure you are super excited to learn them as much as I am. And we're going to go through some of those rules next time in Sif Gimel and Dalid. And once we get through all of that, then we will move on to more rules about Basar b'chalav that don't involve the udder. Thank you for joining our class. Look forward to learning with you next time.